Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. I'm Rebecca Bellan, and this is our Wednesday episode, where we home in on a trend in the tech world and dive deep. Today, I'm talking to Gilman Louie, the CEO and co-founder of America's Frontier Fund. We talk about the push for American startups to help build leading frontier tech, how robotics and AI will change manufacturing, Silicon Valley's embrace of defense tech, and his predictions for 2025. Gilman, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Rebecca.
Now, Gilman, I'm so excited to talk to you because you have, 30 plus years of national security and investment experience. You were the former CEO of In-Q-Tel, which is the tech investment firm funded by the CIA. I believe you worked on the Biden administration's Science and Technology Advisory Council, commissioner on the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence from 2018 to 2021, and now America's Frontier Fund. Am I missing anything?
There's probably a few other things on the list, but it's good to be here.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about America's Frontier Fund. It's part nonprofit, part investment fund, part foundation. There's a lot going on there. Studio, I think, is involved.
At the highest level, when the founders, myself, Jordan Blaszczak, and a few others got together to think about what the U.S. needed in terms of leadership and technology from a global perspective. The U.S. has a lot of advantages, but we did not have capital really organized around the kind of the priorities of what in the national security side of the house or the economic security side of the house focused in on the areas that are necessary to compete on a global basis, particularly on this kind of strategic competition we find ourselves in with other nation states. Mm-hmm. So the idea was to create an organization that not only informed both government and the financial markets, including the venture community, of what the opportunities are, but also to serve as a beacon, a lighthouse of places in which industry could go, the financial services could invest in, the governments can de-risk, that will move the ball forward. So America's Frontier Fund is really dedicated to helping the U.S. continue its leadership in these kind of frontier technologies like AI and next generation energy and bio and ag and a number of other areas that's going to be really important for competitiveness.
Yeah. And so do I take it right that a lot of these have kind of a dual use application?
Yeah. In fact, many are dual use because they're foundational. So let's take an example, next generation energy, whether it's down the road, this idea that we may be able to conquer and solve the fusion issue, clean hydrogen, right? Those energy needs have multi-purposes, not just, security technologies is, funding and supporting things like compute, but also, in the commercial world. And same is true with bio. Clearly, AI has multiple purposes. So, some people are really focused today on what we call mill tech, right? That's just a tiny use of all the kind of technologies that go into that dual use bucket. But even food has dual use, right? I mean, you got to be able to move food around and have food security.
Speaking just briefly on clean energy and everything, we're coming into a new administration. Trump has signaled that he wants to cancel any unspent dollars of the Inflation Reduction Act, which puts a lot of money towards, specifically loans for clean energy startups and companies building battery tech, solar panels, et cetera. How are you thinking about the coming administration, specifically as it relates to clean energy?
Well, what's said on the campaign trail and what actually gets implemented sometimes are two different things, right? I think one of the clear things that the Trump administration realizes is the energy demands that we're going to have for powering up next generation manufacturing, next generation compute is greater than our capacity than we currently have at the rate in which we're consuming that level of energy. So this is really about bringing all the forces of technology and science together to really kind of unlock that. Now, as we do that, these new technology areas tend to have cleaner footprints. They tend to be able to take advantage of the natural environment in a way that's more efficient. Even things like unlocking gases and oils, doing that in a way that is more healthy in the environment is fundamentally economically better. So I don't think there's this grand disconnect between an energy policy which is focused on production and the need to do it in an efficient way that leads to a cleaner environment. I think all those things are consistent, but it requires forethought and it requires kind of a new class of energy extraction and production that we currently don't have. And that's part of the frontier that we're going to be on the journey of.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty bipartisan to say that America has kind of fallen behind when it comes to manufacturing, and that has given us a risk in many ways, security and economic and national security.
Yeah, here's some kind of scary numbers, right? I mean, today the U.S. consumes, you take a look at the total consumption of goods that we consume, we only produce now 10% of that. 20 years ago, it was 80% was produced here in the United States. So one is we have a problem because not only are supply chains at risk, but we have actually lost the ability to actually build things again, right? Kind of take a riff off of the prior campaign, Make America Great Again. It's Make America Build Again, right? And it's not just the STEM folks. It is the trade talents, the skills, right? Plumbers and welders and electricians. My father was a machinist in World War II. I mean, he raised us as a blue-collar family with the idea that there's honor to be building things. And we kind of outsourced that from the 1980s forward. If the U.S. really is going to become and continue to be a powerhouse of the future, it really has to be able to build again. And if we could do that, I think the economy will be stronger. I think, it's not just an employment issue, but the quality of work will be higher as well.
Right. And then how can startups take advantage of that? So I'm not sure if you're going to be focusing more on early stage or later stage startups with the America's Frontier Fund, but what are ways that startups can be thinking about this? I mean, obviously it's we say frontier tech, that's pretty broad. It can mean anything from energy to aerospace to biotech to quantum. So yeah, I guess broadly, and then maybe we can drill down. What is your advice for startups looking to take advantage of this?
We spent the last 20 years going fabless and focusing on a digital economy, and we led the world in that, and it was great. But we also did on the fact that 20 years before that, we had invested in infrastructure. We were building chips. We had fabs. We had the ability to actually engineer and build things like rockets and airplanes in a way that was the envy of the world. So the phrase I use to startups is, show me the path from bits to atoms, right? Can you take the technologies, digital technologies at hand, digital twinning, artificial intelligence, next generation design tools, and apply it in a way that actually builds out our manufacturing infrastructure? So things like robotics, next generation robotics, not like the big machines that look like cranes, but the ability to manipulate things much more efficiently and safely. Can we think about using smaller footprint manufacturing flexible facilities that basically can take what you imagine and in 24 hours switch it into an actual production of actual goods? The promise of additive manufacturing and CNC and many of the other tools hasn't yet really come together in a way that we can go from thought to object in 24 hours. And if we could do that, that would change everything that we think about, not only how we make things, but actually the unit economics that allows startups to get to profitability much more quickly than having to be in an environment where you basically design overseas, you send it to contract manufacturing, in places like China, 6 months of turnaround and having to produce hundreds of thousands of an item to kind of get it down to a unit volume that can actually make money. It feels very archaic, right? It hasn't really changed in the last 40 or 50 years. I mean, the tools are a little bit better, but unit economics really hasn't changed. These new tools can change all of that. And I think that revolution could happen here in the US.
So are there any startups that you've noticed or types of startups that are kind of solving for those pain points in manufacturing today?
I think there's a big movement in large language models to kind of go from the ability to create, images and text to actually help in design of physical goods, right? There's a whole field of study around the use of LLMs in describing everyday physical environments, which is the first step that you need to be able to use these kinds of tools for design and manufacturing. I also think there's a big effort right now on robotics and engineering. Now, China, it's the world's largest producer of this current generation of robots. But there's a next generation of robotics that's on the near horizon, which is not just, make them look more like human, but having all the advantages that a human has over something that looks like, a crane with a pincer on the other side. That dexterity, that level of accuracy, the ability to do things at a very small scale or at a very large scale, right, is happening right now. I mean, a lot of companies are beginning to look at these problems and these challenges.
Yeah.
Lego has put out 2 generations of kids who grew up on Lego robotics. And as these younger folks who have grown up on robotics begins to get into startups and industry, the return of the mechanical engineer.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's exciting when you got these young 20-year-olds who want to change the world by what they can build. I mean,
right.
To Elon's credit, you look up and you see SpaceX or Starlink, right? Or you see a Tesla driving down the street, and that is, the power of building things.
Right.
So it's now in vogue. It's in fashion. And people want to say, hey, yeah, do I need another piece of social media tool? Is that what I want to be known for? Or do I want to be known for, creating something that's great and physical?
Yeah. Yeah. There's certainly like a push, almost like away from even just SaaS in general and like consumer tech that doesn't like solve anyone's problems or help make the world a better place, right? But I mean, that said, I just did notice a very large round going to a mobile games company that I was like,
But even the gaming space, there's a whole movement now to retro games. I was, Palmer Luckey, the creator of Oculus, is investing in the little companies besides some of his defense tech work and recreating handheld Game Boy style machines, right? That kind of return back to actually fidgeting with a machine.
A simpler time.
A simpler time, right?
We all love nostalgia. I mean, that's probably why the Stranger Things did so well, right?
Exactly.
Well, you brought up Palmer Luckey. I did want to talk to you a little bit about defense tech and kind of the Silicon Valley embrace of that. Specifically, we talk about Anduril, which is Palmer Luckey's current company, and they're using, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but they're using kind of like consumer off-the-shelf parts to create these like really cheap drones, giving them to Ukraine, and they're using them to take down $20,000 Russian tanks, right? So there's this interesting movement that we're seeing in Silicon Valley's embrace of defense tech, and it's a step change in a lot of ways from what we've seen in the past, and we've talked about this on the show before.
Yeah.
But yeah, curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I know Silicon Valley tends to rewrite our history, right, based on the last great thing that we created. But if you go back to the history of Silicon Valley, it really was built on the base of defense tech. The engineers, the scientists all got together in World War II. Silicon Valley was, where a lot of the radar and electronics work was being done for the U.S. military. That kind of created Silicon Valley. Multiple generations later, from places like Lockheed, who was pretty much kind of owned the valley back in the 50s and the 60s, to today the modern versions of that, like Anduril, are trying to not just use tech to improve defense, but the realization that the nature of warfare has completely changed. Mm-hmm. If you watch what's going on in the Ukraine, as you pointed out, cheap, in many cases, wooden drones being built by Ukrainian furniture manufacturers teamed up with kids who used to do drone racing. Ukrainian drone racers before the war were best of class. And how they used that tech, that everyday tech, to transform the battlefield. And everybody, all the military forces are kind of studying what's going on in the Ukraine as we speak. And it's a very unfortunate situation because there are a lot of, lots of displaced civilians. So there's, war is ugly. It's not something to glorify. But the reality is big systems are vulnerable to swarms of little systems. And I think the way we think about inside the Defense Department, particularly the Pentagon, building out these kind of multi-billion-dollar platforms, that everything requires these 10 to 20-year development cycles, right? Well, there is a place for that. If we don't have the muscle to be able to build large amounts of low-cost systems that can change the battlefield, we'll be on the wrong end of the power curve. In other words, we'll be the Russians and somebody else will be the Ukrainians. And so I think the Valley is beginning to realize this. Now, the issue of whether defense is something that technologists want to work on, particularly here in Silicon Valley, it's kind of self-selecting.
Right.
I think there's a group of technologists who believes in a strong national defense, right? If you have a strong national defense, it reduces the temptation of somebody else from doing something to you that you don't want to have happen. But if you find yourself in a fight, or a partner or ally finds itself in a fight it doesn't want to be in, it will have the tools to defend itself. And I think there's a strong body of evidence that shows that Silicon Valley isn't this kind of view that many people have, that, it's pacifism, it's we don't want to deal with military, we don't want to deal with the world that these technologies can hurt people, because they're seeing what's happening playing out in real time.
It's been a shift, and it's certainly in my lifetime. I mean, I grew up thinking it's just a bunch of very liberal people in Silicon Valley who do no evil, right? That was Google's slogan, and you had developers and engineers walking out protesting if any of their tech was sold to the Israeli military. But now that there's a shift, and certainly in the beats that I cover, I'm noticing a lot of companies just actively being and we got DoD funding and we're working with the military, and it's exciting for them because there's been a funding drought, and this is a surefire way to get money so that it can continue to build their tech, which, in a lot of cases it's autonomy or it's, eVTOLs, right? Like Anduril and Archer just both teamed up to build a defense aircraft. And there's kind of not that they should be shamed, but there's no shame in it. There's just we need to work on American defense. That's the mood of the day. But I guess the ideological shift that I've noticed is not only that we're embracing defense tech, but it's embracing defense tech because America needs to be first so our enemies don't get to us, rather than America needs to be the world superpower because we're a liberal democracy. And it's important that to balance the scales of, China, which is a one-party state, effectively run by a dictator. So it feels like that has become almost a children's story. And it's oh, that's nice. But no, really, it's about wars coming. I don't know how you think about it.
Well, I think that the views kind of covered the entire spectrum, right? Between, we had to have a strong national defense to dissuade a country like China or North Korea or Iraq from doing something, Iran, from doing something that we don't want them to do. We don't want to tempt our competitors with weakness. I think there's a strong view of that side. But the other side of it is also true. If you find yourself or an ally in the middle of a fight and they're unable to protect themselves, it's not good for the world. This is the whole Ukrainian situation where everybody thought the Russians were going to march in to Kyiv within 2 weeks and Ukraine would fall. And it didn't, because, it had a relatively strong military, but it also understood how to fight with the tools they had. And I think companies like Anduril and some of the new defense tech entrepreneurs are saying we can have better tools than these kind of blunt instruments, where we have to send in aircraft carriers and the use of, cruise missiles and all the expensive technologies that we spent the last 50 years creating. And we think about this, that it allows us to be much more agile, much more flexible. Here's another statistic that is kind of shocking. If you look at all the dollars the U.S. military spends in military systems, you take away the people and the infrastructure, you just talk about systems, over 50% of the U.S. defense budget is spent on systems that are over 30 years old, right? So
wow.
We got a $900 billion budget, almost $1 trillion, right? And you take about half of that and you apply that to systems. That's a lot of money to be keeping up with systems that were done by, that my father, or in some cases, my grandfather worked on, right? It's
right.
I think it's time for this kind of new revolution to take place, and we think about the Defense Department and how we build systems and what does it mean to have technological and numeric superiority.
When we think about the startups and the technology players that will be, trying to get DoD funding, as an investor as well, do you recommend that they is it time to focus fully on defense, right? Or do you kind of still build the dual use at the same time? Motorola, right, was, I think, a defense company at the start.
Exactly.
Right?
They did the radars, right?
Yeah, they made the radars. And then, you talk about World War II. I'm pretty sure all the companies that were in Detroit making cars started building tanks, right? Like they switched at some point. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I don't know. How do you recommend that companies that have the dual use case think about where they should be focusing their, at times, limited funds and resources?
Well, one of the things I'd like to recommend to startups who are interested in working with things like defense tech is the U.S. government needs, both in defense as well as in its other capabilities like intelligence, right, requires a level of sophistication that exists to solve a problem they have today, then in many cases, the commercial world will have that same problem tomorrow. It is how we went from doing satellite imagery that was clearly in the realm of governments to being used every single day to, look at what house to buy, right, on Google Earth or Google Maps. The advantage that the U.S. government has isn't its money. I mean, yes, you can get money from the U.S. government, but it's easier to get money from a venture capitalist than the government, right? A lot less paperwork, a lot less headaches, right? You can go down Silicon Valley and, pitch 20 venture capitalists in a day, whereas, good luck in getting your forms in over the next year. That's hundreds of pages of competition. But the advantage that the government has is its problems. You solve a big data problem in government, you probably solve a big data problem in the commercial world. You think of companies like Oracle. Larry's first project was for the intelligence community on Project Oracle, right? SpaceX, first missions were U.S. government-funded missions. Even Tesla, the car, right, had a large grant from the energy department because they're trying to solve these kind of problems at scale.
Okay, so try to cut your teeth with government, but make your bread in the commercial space.
Yeah, and look, government contracts are big, right? I mean, they're large if you win them,
right? And
they will give you development dollars as you get down the path.
Yeah, if you get the contract, right? If you get that, right. But we're moving our hands in the same way, but the listener can't see.
They can't see the hands.
The ongoing funds rather than just a little bit of an investment to see what you can do.
Exactly right.
Okay. Speaking of startups and how they can stay competitive, what are your predictions for 2025 in terms of what are going to be the hot frontier tech, dual use, et cetera, sectors? You mentioned robotics earlier.
Yeah, so let's kind of go through the kind of range of kind of things that we're
Maybe
seeing.
Top three. Let's see, top three. Where do you think the money's going?
So first of all, lots of money is going already into large language models, right? So we all know about AI. But this idea of large language models being used in the physical world.
Is it still a large language model then?
It's still large language models because we basically take a description of the world, turn it into its own symbolic language, and then we process that in a way for the LLMs to understand.
So that you can get that kind of generalized robotic intelligence.
Right. It's coming up with a new language. In fact, you're kind of coming up with a new language of expression of the physical world that a LLM can process. I think that's going to be a big area.
Yeah. Definitely.
So lots of people working on that, these kind of early startups worth $1 billion or more already, right? Beginning to work that problem.
Yeah, it's wild, these valuations.
It's kind of crazy, but we're going to see a lot of that. I think we're beginning to see robotic startups being taken very seriously. I mean, in the past, it was like, great, you can build a robotic startup, but all the manufacturing lines are in China.
Yes.
But today, because we're trying to de-risk and either onshore or friendshore, we have a problem. We have a labor shortage. We don't have enough skilled labor just to throw people onto the assembly line to start building things. So you have to use automation. We're going to have to figure out how to build an order of magnitude more goods with an order of magnitude less people.
Yeah, Japan's been really good at this. They're so good at this because they have that population problem. And
exactly.
So you're seeing a lot of robotics take over there.
So you're going to see robotics in Japan, you're going to see robotics in Europe, and you're going to see robotics in the US, which makes the opportunity set for robotic startups, particularly those who leverage those large language models, who understand the physical world. You blend those two together, and you have a whole new capability. Elon pushes the concept of these gigafactories. Great. Gigafactories have a place in the world. But I'm looking for small factories the size of factories that can be fit into half a Walmart or a Target.
I feel like we've tried that a little bit. I feel like there have been a couple of startups that have tried this and fallen.
There are a few of them.
Yeah, but there's a few that have like tried this kind of like micro factory, hyper local, super quick, make it off the production line. It's there with the customer, but then they just like haven't worked out.
Two reasons. Sometimes you're on the bleeding edge versus the leading edge. So
right, okay.
If you tried it a couple of years ago versus today, the demand function is, I got it onshore. A few years ago, that may not have been the case.
Yeah.
Second, the tools are much better. So with the tools and manufacturing being better and more efficient, particularly with new materials, the unit costs can become competitive. And so you got to do both. The unit cost has to be down, you have to be agile, and you have to solve a demand function, right, of what it is that needs to be produced in the U.S. Defense tech is pretty good because, we do not want to be building our next generation cameras in China.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So in some respects, which goes back again to our earlier discussion around defense tech, that's, perhaps a really good place to start about teaming up with the U.S. government for these manufacturing capabilities. And the U.S. government will de-risk it for you, right? They have the Office of Strategic Capital from the Department of Defense, whose job it is to provide capital at a lower cost and incentivize funds and companies to produce things here in the U.S. that are critical to the United States. Now, the other areas that I think that could be kind of transformative this year to think about is this whole area around digital twinning, right?
And we've been talking about it for a while, but now it feels like, with world models, it seems like now is the time we're actually going to see some progress. I mean, I don't know if you've been in the VR of certain digital twins and you're like, yeah, I guess this is fine. Like,
yeah, but, in full disclosure, I'm on the board of Niantic. So,
okay.
I see Pokemon everywhere when I put on my goggles. But I think digital twinning is going to be really, really important because you can't really apply AI in an aggressive way to try things out a billion times before you build it, unless you have a model of it. LLM solve a certain class of problems, but you still have to verify what it comes up with. Is it going to actually work? And using more traditional AI methodologies, you need those digital twins. So there's going to be a big push on digital twin everything.
Yeah.
That includes things like biology. Can we do a digital twin of a cell? Can we do a predictive model on energy consumption based on devices that we're building? Those models will define whether a company produces a product that really is competitive or not in the near future.
Yeah.
Those are kind of like my big bets that I would be making.
Cool. Yeah, good to know. And then is there any advice for startups that want to pitch you, that are interested, that have, startups in these realms that you speak of?
So whether it's myself or any other venture capitalist, right? There are a couple of things I tell all entrepreneurs to do. The first thing is don't worry about getting a lot of no's, because the best ideas tend to have been turned down many times before they actually got the funding. I mean, think about it. I remember I was much younger. I was sitting in Kleiner Perkins' office. I had my video game company that Kleiner Perkins had back, and they said, "Hey, we got this guy. He's going to come in and pitch this idea of having a virtual bookstore." Anyway, I said, what a dumb idea. Like, books have no margin. What do you mean? You're going to buy books across the mail? You don't get to browse it and have a cup of coffee? How are you going to compete with the big box bookstores? And this crazy young guy named Jeff Bezos was sitting in and saying that he was going to change the world by having the world's biggest bookstore in a warehouse. The other thing I tell entrepreneurs is think big and think bold. Don't try to pitch what you think the VCs want to hear. Pitch the pitch of what you want to build, and find the venture capitalist who shares that vision, who wants to build it with you, versus just trying to get money at a high price. It's just like, I got funded. The art is not to be funded. The art is to be funded by somebody who shares your vision to build something that's great. And the last point I want to make, which is a piece of advice I got when I was a young entrepreneur. I was fortunate. I didn't know it at the time. I was 26. I got my company funded by Kleiner Perkins and Excel. I had these two young partners, Vinod Khosla. I was Jim Breyer's first deal, right, that he ever did out of Excel.
Yeah.
And I asked Vinod, I said, what are you looking for when you make an investment? I was a game company, and The guys who were trying to get money also were, people who were doing life extension and cancer drugs. And, I'm a video game company. They chose to invest in me and not in those other companies. But notice something that was really important to me. He goes, look, at the end of the day, we got to believe entrepreneurs will be successful. Otherwise, we wouldn't give them any money in the first place. But there's nothing worse than actually investing in a successful company that many years post-investment, you look back and nobody really cared. It didn't make a difference in the world. It didn't move the needle.
Yeah.
So this is the big and bold. The last part is it's got to make a difference. Otherwise, do something else there. If you just want to make money, there's plenty of easier ways to make money than to start a company. But if you're going to put your life and soul behind building something, a good portion of your life, and not all of it, make it count.
Yeah. That's great advice. I love that. Make it count. Okay, well, we're about out of time. Is there anywhere that our listeners can connect with you online?
Yes, they can always connect to me either on my Facebook account, you just go off and look for Gilman Louie, or send an email to gilman@americasfrontier.com and you'll find us.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us on the show. Really enjoyed this chat. To our listeners, you can find me. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Threads. I'm on X. And you can find Equity at EquityPod. Talk to you all Friday.
Equity is produced by Theresa Loconsolo with editing by Kell. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavet, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.